Hey, what's going on everybody? It's ETA Prime back here again. Today we're going to be taking a look at the all-new ASUS TUF Dash F15 laptop. Now this is powered by an 11th gen Intel i7 CPU, and it's paired up with an RTX 3060 laptop variant. Before we get started here, I do want to mention that this video is not sponsored in any way. I paid my own money for this. I've been trying to get my hands on one of these for a little while. This will be my personal laptop, and I really didn't want to break the bank with something more powerful than this with, let's say, a 3070 or a 3080. I personally don't need all that power on the go, but I think this will be more than sufficient with that RTX 3060. Plus, this has Thunderbolt 4 built in, so if I do need a little extra power, I can always connect it to an eGPU. Another big reason I wanted to pick this one up versus some other ones that I saw was the portability. I mean, this thing is actually pretty thin for being a decently spec'd out gaming laptop. The top is aluminum. Unfortunately, the bottom of this thing is plastic, but it's coming in at 19.9 millimeters thin. Inside of the box, we'll also get a 200 watt power supply, and the RTX 3060 that's built into this laptop will run at up to 85 watts. And I'm pretty sure the only other thing this comes with is a user manual. So overall, I am a big fan of this design here. We have a 15.6-inch IPS 1080p display at 144 Hz. As for the keyboard, it is LED backlit, it's not RGB. We have 1.7 millimeters of travel, and this is one of their newer chiclet quiet keyboards. It does feel pretty decent, but one thing that turns me off about these ASUS keyboards is the different colored WASD keys. I personally don't like this. I wish they would have just left them the same as the rest of the keyboard, but this is something that I can definitely overlook. When it comes to I/O on the Dash F15, we do get a full-size Ethernet port, HDMI 2.0, USB 3.2, Thunderbolt 4, and the 3.5mm audio jack. All of this is over on the left-hand side. Moving over to the right, we have two more USB 3.2 ports, and that's about it for I/O on this unit. It does have 802.11ax Wi-Fi built in, so we do have Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.1. This uses a dual fan cooling system with 5 heat pipes, and we have 4 exhaust ports on this. It'll actually exhaust air out of each side, right and left, and we also have 2 more on the rear. And in my testing so far, it's actually stayed pretty cool given the form factor of this laptop. As for the basic specs of the Dash F15, for the CPU we have the 11th gen i7. It's an 11370H, 4 cores, 8 threads, base clock of 3.3 GHz with a boost up to 4.8. RTX 3060 laptop GPU, we have 6 GB of GDDR6. It runs at 1525 MHz, plus we have an 85 watt boost, but most of the time this GPU is sitting at around 80 watts. 16 GB of DDR4. We have 8 GB soldered, and there's an 8 GB stick here, so we only have 1 DIMM. I was really hoping there were 2 DIMMs, but a lot of these manufacturers are soldering some onto the board, and this is no different. The model that I have here came with a 512 GB NVMe SSD, but there's an extra slot in here so you can always add more down the road. As for the display, it's a 15.6-inch IPS at 1920 by 1080, 144 Hz adaptive sync, and a 76 watt-hour battery. Alright, so before we jump right into it, I just wanted to show you a couple things here. This is hardware info. This is a 35 watt mobile CPU. Power limit 1 is set at 64 watts for 56 seconds. We also have the same thing at 2.4 seconds, but most of the time the CPU will be running at about 28 watts. Now this will change a bit here, the long duration and short duration, depending on what settings you have set up in the Armory crate. Now this is built into ASUS and TUF laptops. We have a few power profiles here. Right now we're set to silent. This is going to reduce the noise, but it's also going to limit the TDP and speed on the GPU and the CPU. We can bump this up to performance, see that graph change a little bit, but in all of my testing, we're set to turbo. Now this will increase the noise of the laptop itself. The fan in here will kick on pretty good, but this is the best performance that we're going to be able to get out of this laptop, and that's really what I wanted to test it with. So the first thing I did was run a few benchmarks. Here we have PC Mark 10 with a total score of 5,857. Next on the list we have 3D Mark Night Raid with a total score of 32,626. Moving up a bit to Fire Strike, coming in at 15,913. And finally, Time Spy with a 7,116. These scores are definitely looking good in my opinion, but these are benchmarks and I really want to see how this thing handles real-world gaming, so that's what we got next. First up, Forza Horizon 4, Ultra settings, 1080p, got an average of 105 FPS. It's really smooth here on this 144Hz display. Now I'm not going to be filming the screen with each one of these tests. I'm actually just going to go ahead and plug this into my game capture so we can get a better look at everything. And what I've done is just tested 9 more games for this video. Here we have Overwatch, 1080p, ultra settings. Looking pretty good here. This is a very well optimized game, and going into this one I knew it was going to run well. I got an average of 148 FPS, so this is one of those games that you can play at ultra on this 144Hz display and get the full effect of the system. And just like Overwatch, CSGO runs like a dream. Very high settings, 1080p, no problem at all playing this one. By the end of this run, I had an average of 171 FPS. Going into Doom Eternal, I was actually a little worried that we wouldn't get great performance out of it, but at 1080p ultra settings, I got an average of 112 FPS. It's looking really nice on this 144Hz display, and while we're not at 144Hz, definitely a lot smoother than 60. Microsoft Flight Simulator, this is one that was giving me some issues, and I think it really comes down to that CPU. 1080p, medium-low mixed settings, got an average of 41 FPS out of this. I also tested this at low, hoping I could get 60 out of it, but I only averaged around 53 FPS on all low settings, so this is just one of those games that's really hard to run, but if you set this at 30, you can still have a really enjoyable experience with it. Dirt 5 is another one of those games that I thought I'd have to take the settings way down with this, even with that 3060 and that i7, but it did pretty good. 1080p, ultra high settings, got an average of 78 FPS out of this one. Call of Duty Warzone, 1080p, high settings, 91 FPS. Now this was actually the first time I played this game. It looks absolutely amazing. I was surprised at how good this game looks. GTA 5 1080p, I did mix it up a bit, very high settings, got an average of 91 FPS out of it. Alright, so Cyberpunk 2077. I wanted to test this with RTX on, ray tracing on, so we're set to 1080p, ray tracing ultra, that's just one of the preset settings in Cyberpunk 2077. Now to tell you the truth, I thought it was going to do a lot worse than this. 1080p with the ultra RTX presetting netted me 31 FPS on average. It does dip down below 30 every once in a while, but I expected it to do a lot worse. Now if you're really interested in playing this game at a higher frame rate, you will have to take it on down, and even after messing around with the settings for a little while, what I did was just have a mix of low and medium settings. It still drops below 60. This one's just a really hard game to run. And the final game I tested was Red Dead Redemption 2. This is just the built-in benchmark. 1080p, high settings. I think it did a pretty decent job because we had a minimum of 50, a maximum of 111, and an average of 76. So before we wrap this up, I just wanted to give you a look at the internals here and give you an idea of the upgradability. Pulling the bottom off is super simple, just need to pull the screws out. We have that 76 watt-hour battery. Really impressed with the battery life, we'll take a look at that in a second. Our NVMe SSD, Wi-Fi 6 card, we have our dual fan setup with the quad output. We also have another M.2 slot here, so we can easily add another NVMe SSD. And when it comes to the RAM, like I mentioned, 8GB is soldered to the board, plus we have an 8GB stick in here. You could easily upgrade this to 24GB by throwing a 16GB stick in here, but I really do wish there were 2 DIMMs. It just would have made it a lot easier to go up to 32GB in this laptop, but I understand form factor was really the issue. So as for battery life, I was pretty impressed by this. PC Mark 8 using the RTX 3060 got me 4 hours and 57 minutes. Netflix with the internal XE graphics, 10 hours and 7 minutes, and GTA 5 in performance mode with VSync locked at 60, I got 2 hours and 7 minutes out of this thing. So in the end, I'm really happy with this laptop. Performance, form factor, and battery life. Now, there could have been a few things that were changed, like even the CPU itself, because I did notice that in some of the harder to run games, like Microsoft Flight Simulator and 2077, we were pretty CPU bound given that this is a quad-core Intel chip, so if this was paired up with an 8-core Ryzen, it probably would have done a lot better in those games, but for the price of this thing, coming in at around $1,100, is actually a little under $1,100 on Best Buy, I'm happy with the purchase. Of course, you can always throw more money at a laptop and get higher specs, but I was looking for something mid-range, light, good battery life, and decent performance, and I think I found it here with the Dash 15 and that RTX 3060. But there's still a lot more that I want to test on this thing, especially emulation, and given the single core performance that this i7 is putting out, I think we're going to get some really good results. And not to mention the higher end emulators that really take advantage of those extra threads. Even though we have 4 cores, we do have 8 threads, and emulators like RPCS3 for PS3 really rely on those extra threads for the harder to run games, and I think we're going to get some really good results out of this thing. I'm personally not worried about the GPU not being able to handle emulation. It really comes down to the CPU, and I think this Tiger Lake i7 will handle pretty much everything that I throw at it. But that's going to wrap it up for this one. Really appreciate you watching. If you're interested in learning more about these, or if you want to pick one up, I will leave a few links in the description. And if there's anything specific you want tested on this, just let me know in the comments below. But that's it for this one, and like always, thanks for watching.